Hi everyone and welcome. I'm down here with my European nightcrawler bins. Well, one's a bin, one's a bag. And it's been 9 days since we last checked in on these. At that time they received a little bit of food. It was some fruits, some grapes, some banana peels, some plantains. It was not a large feeding by any measure. And at that time I don't think we added any bedding. I don't think we added any coffee even. No grit. It was just some food. And it was 9 days, so I think we're probably not going to see a lot of leftovers. But I'm going to come back in here now today after 9 days, see how that last feeding is holding up, if there's any leftovers at all. And we're going to give these guys a little bit more food today. So let's get the camera in a little bit close and see what we got going on. I'm definitely curious to see how the fruits are holding up after after 9 days of being in here. Because it was a variety of different stuff that you would imagine wouldn't last long. And that looks pretty promising too. Look at all those castings. I think that larger piece of plastic that I upgraded to a few feedings ago was helping a lot. Definitely keeping a lot more moisture down within the bin. Even out here on the edges, the stuff has a little bit of dampness to it. With that smaller piece of plastic that didn't go all the way out to the edges, the stuff on the edges was a lot drier. But this stuff looks a little bit better than it has been. A lot of this paper here on the top is starting to show its age, but I'm not really seeing many signs of it being consumed. You would think that it would get nibbled up a little bit, but maybe it's just not damp enough. Maybe if the stuff was actually sunken down into the bedding, it might actually start getting a little bit more action. That's something I've been considering doing at this point, since it's kind of nice. You know, you can see it's got worm activity because it is covered in castings. So whatever moisture it is collecting from the plastic that's above it is making it into a nice environment the worms seem to like cruising around in and on top of. And I've got more of it if I really wanted to put some fresh stuff like that down and maybe use a little bit of this stuff as bedding underneath the feeding. And I might actually do that, because I've not put fresh bedding in this bin, I think, for a while now. And that wouldn't hurt at all. I don't think I had put coffee in here last time. I think the last thing that went in here was strictly fruits. I think I put food in here. I didn't put bedding. I didn't put grit. Nothing. I do have the grit on standby here. I was thinking I might add a little bit of grit with this feeding. But I do remember placing certain things on top of the feeding after the fact. Stuff that were a little bit older, like this. I believe this is the outer husk of a mango seed. And it's pretty incredible how I could just tear it in between my fingers and rip it up into little chunks. Now I think we're starting to see some signs of the previous feeding. This is a part of that plantain that I had cut into little discs. It doesn't look like it's really been consumed a great deal. I think I saw a banana peel, which was also part of the last feeding. So it does seem like we've got some leftovers from the previous feeding. They're pretty much intact. I usually assume that it's going to take a little while for the foods that I add to really start seeing some action. So I'm not surprised to see that some of this stuff is still not being eaten. But I know that it's already been in here for 9 days, so I know it's going to start getting consumed soon. And that's the reason I'm, not too worried about putting that next dose of food in, because that too needs time for the breakdown process to begin, so that at some point in the future the worms can also tackle that stuff as well. So I don't really subscribe to the idea of not feeding just because I see leftovers. I'll usually assume that those leftovers that I'm encountering are the things that they're going to either be able to eat now or eat in the very near future, and that the stuff I'm adding now is really meant for weeks and weeks from now, So I'm going to open up this hole down here a little bit so I can drop in the next feeding. I just like to take a closer look at some of the things that are still remaining in here from previous feedings to see how they're progressing. And we did find a couple items, so the stuff is breaking down. But there's no harm in placing some additional stuff in here to reinforce the food supply. Sometimes I wonder how things would look in here if I just left it, you know, left it for a month or two or longer. At that point, I'm assuming that the stuff would be, for the most part, broken down, and we'd have almost nothing but castings in here. And that might be the next step one of these days, because this bin has been around for such a long time that it is probably due for a harvest, which really just doesn't mean anything other than opening up the hatch on the bottom and dropping some of the castings that are down at the bottom out and collecting them up. And I'm definitely curious to see how that stuff looks down there, because I've never harvested anything out of this bin before, believe it or not, after I don't know how many days. I mean, this bin has been around for a long time now. I could even ask Siri, hey Siri, how many days have elapsed since May 26th, 2019?
It was 585 days ago.
Wow. 585-day-old bin. Well, yeah, a lot of worms once you start picking down deeper. I don't think I went this deep last time. And I don't think we saw this many worms last time either. It is kind of nice to finally encounter a nice ball of worms hanging out down there. I guess these worms just tend to like it down deeper. These are the European nightcrawlers. So maybe it does make good sense to make a nice deep pit to place their food into. This way they don't have to come up for it. They can just have it right there at their disposal. So I've definitely created a good sized hole here. And what do you say we actually dump a lot of this stuff right down into the feeding zone now? Because I do have fresh bedding like this that we can drop right on top. But this stuff is probably very densely infiltrated by all kinds of bacteria and fungi and all the stuff that is necessary to help it break down. I think that just by being out on the surface, though, it's maybe it's just not getting the attention that it could be getting if it was surrounded by all kinds of yummy foods and stuff. So let's give this a try. I'm going to go ahead and place our feeding for today right into a little bed of paper. Yeah, the glove is very dry. Usually if stuff in the bin is overly damp, it sticks all over the glove, but we're definitely not seeing that here. And then I've got a whole bunch of, look at that, it's a whole chunk of red cabbage. I can't tell if this is actually multiple little chunks or it almost looks like some stuff hanging off of the main stem. So I don't know if I'm going to be able to break that apart. I've got other pieces of red cabbage here I could throw in. I've got a cucumber here. Let's see what else we can fish out of here. Oops. I just dug down deeper into the bag of mixed kitchen scraps to pull out some more fine chunk stuff. And I think that amounts to a fairly generous feeding at this point. Good amount of fruits and veggies in there. You could see some grapes. I don't even know what some of this stuff is. Soup vegetables. A whole variety of different yummy stuff for them to eat. What's that? Strawberry. Mostly veggies, I would say, but also a couple chunks of fruits here and there. So I think this should amount to a pretty good size feeding relative to what they received last time, which wasn't really all that much. Oh, here's all that stuff that we picked out on the way down. So let's make sure that all this old food that we picked out is also down here too. I want to try to limit the amount of food that I leave out on the top surface. So I'm glad I've got all this material out here on the edges to cover up with. I don't want to end up attracting all kinds of little flying insects and pests to this bin by, you know, leaving stuff uncovered. So I got a feeling that this bin's going to be good for quite a while. I thought that after 9 days it'd be less leftovers, but maybe the cooler temperatures as we're getting into winter here are slowing down the composting activity. And that's not surprising. That's pretty much normal and to be expected. So maybe I've got to extend the feeding cycles a little bit, the interval between the feedings, or maybe just feed a little bit less. So let's grab some of this paper that I've had here for way too long now. Stuff that I've been thinking that would be gone by now, but somehow I've just not had that much use for it lately. Get it into a bin and let it start serving a purpose, right? And it's quite a bit now, right? You've got all that bedding down under the food and a whole bunch of fresh bedding on top, which is going to be useful for continuing to capture moisture that would normally just evaporate out of the bin. So that should make this into a space where the worms feel pretty comfortable just zipping around inside of. And I still can't believe how clean my glove is. I've actually thought about maybe adding some moisture to this bin at some point. I'm not sure if it's a little bit too dry, but it's not terrible. The worms seem to be pretty comfortable in it. Maybe at some point in the future I'll include a little bit of additional moisture into the bin somehow. Maybe squirt some water in, or maybe even come up with some sort of a feeding that consists of much more damp, moisture-rich foods. But I'm glad that this plastic is here on top to keep the moisture from just evaporating, because otherwise this bin would just be extremely dry otherwise. So let's move over to the other one that we've got the European night crawlers in, the clear plastic tub, and get those guys fed too. So I think once we get into this bin, we're going to see a slightly different situation here. I remember that this bin was a lot more damp than the VermiBag Mini. And it was for that reason we tried to crop in the outer edges of this plastic covering to allow for a little bit of airflow to occur out on the outer edges. Seems like we got some little flying insects that have made themselves at home down here within this container. I don't know, I think some people might have mentioned that it could be that the cardboard that we were covering up with could be part of the reason. Here too we can see a flying insect. Might even be two flying insects. Ooh, look at that. I'm all covered in purple now because of the purple cabbage. Sometimes I wonder if it's this cardboard that's ending up becoming a haven for the flying insects. So if things have dried off, we can probably return to using this plastic to cover up with fully again, go out to the outer edges again. Because maybe just by mixing what's in the middle that might still be a little bit damp with these materials out on the outer edges, maybe we'll be kind of back in balance. I don't think things were out of control in terms of the moisture level in here, but I do feel that they were a little bit damp, and that was why we tried to get a little bit of drying off to occur. You know, I mean, it's not a very deep system either, so you could feel that it's dry almost all the way right down to the bottom. Even down here at the bottom, the material feels kind of dry. So I got a feeling it might be a good idea here to sort of stir all the material together and combine some of this dry stuff with some more damp stuff so that the moisture levels can sort of equalize a little bit. And maybe we'll use this paper here to sort of create a little foundation for the feeding. Maybe we could place this down underneath the feeding like we did in the VermiBag Mini. Although we've got quite a bit here, I'm not sure. We might have a hard time covering it all up since we don't have a great deal of material here in this bin. I always feel like I'm a little bit cramped when I'm in these shallow bins. It's part of the reason I don't use them so much lately. I've been gravitating more towards using my deeper bins. And I've even, you know, at times moved populations of worms out of these shallower bins into deeper bins just so they can continue on. Because at some point you just feel like you're running out of room. You can't just work. You just can't get work done within a bin that's too shallow. So yeah, I think it is time to restore the plastic covering all the way out to the edge again and let things get damp in here again. I think one of the telltales of things maybe being a little bit too damp in here might have been little creepy crawlies. I think we were starting to see springtail activity in here. Check out this worm. It's got such distinct striping on it. Is that a European nightcrawler? I thought there was something about one particular breed of worm that has these really distinct stripes on them, and I didn't think it was the European nightcrawler. Maybe we've got sort of a mix happening in here too. Some sort of an exchange program going on between bins that I'm unaware of. But I do feel like I'm not that good at telling one worm species from another. I don't know, if you've been watching my channel, you'll know that I tend to just deal with the whole bin as a whole as sort of a single large unit, and that I treat these more as like a colony of worms. And I rarely, you know, get down to the individual worm level. I rarely, you know, pick up a worm and say, oh wow, look at that pretty worm, or hey, look at that big fat worm. I usually just treat them as just one population that has a mission as a whole to do what I want. Because, I mean, on an individual basis, these little guys aren't going to achieve much. It's only when you've got them in mass working for you to do a mission that you're going to see any sort of results. But the topic keeps coming up. In the beginning, I always used to have red wigglers only, and then I got European nightcrawlers, African nightcrawlers. More recently, I got some blue worms. So the topic has started interesting me now that I've got a variety of different worms. It feels like I should be able to tell one from the other, but I still feel like I'm not very good at that. So I'm gradually kind of working my way inboard from the outer edge over here on my left. Just trying to see how things look. Even though the outer edges were really drying out at this point, there's a lot of moisture still down in the middle. It's all kind of gooey and muddy and kind of nasty. A lot of this food is still in the process of breaking down. Can't even tell what the heck this is. This might be the outer skin of a piece of plantain. I think that gooey stuff in the middle is plantain. It does seem like the plantain made a little bit more progress in this bin than it did in the Vermibag Mini. Maybe this bin was just running a little lower on food, and they were more inspired to tackle the fresh food in here than they were in the other bin. So I'm trying to think in terms of how I'm going to be able to pull this off here. I do have all kinds of scraps that I'm observing now. I got banana or plantain stem right there, and all kinds of other stuff over here, which appears to just be scraps of this and that. This also looks like maybe the end of a one of those plantains that I hacked into bits. And all kinds of other things here too. Don't even know. Potato peels maybe. Broccoli, I believe. This is just going back to previous feedings. And something tells me that those are the sort of things that I had last fed with. Here's another seed. The shell or husk of a mango seed. One that was clearly cut in half. This is usually like how I like to test it, to see if I'm able to snap it or break it in my hand. Because this stuff is so tough, you know. It's so high fibrous and really tough stuff. This piece of it's kind of hard, but I was able to break through another chunk of it. The remainder of it is still kind of flexible. Got to be careful though, because it is flexible, kind of springy, and a lot of times I end up launching chunks of stuff around the room when I do that. So I'm trying to scoop stuff up that I can cover up with later, but hopefully stuff that's not riddled with food. But I'm finding it kind of difficult to do that. It feels like everything I'm pulling up off the middle section is commingled with food and stuff. And it does look to me like we'd actually already done what I talked about earlier, which was I think we did take a lot of this paper strips, these shredded paper pieces, and use them as bedding to place below the feeding. And I'm wondering if that would just be a good idea at this point, because a lot of this paper is a little bit dry, especially the stuff that was near the outer edges. I mean, granted, a lot of it is kind of damp, but I don't want to have this paper sitting in my bin forever. I'd like to see it eventually getting consumed along with the food. And I know it's sort of serving a bedding purpose in here, mainly, but I'd also like to see it get consumed over time, and I don't see many signs of that happening quite yet. So yeah, I'm starting to feel like I am almost inevitably going to have material mixed with food almost everywhere at this point. So I think, you know, maybe we can lay all this paper down under today's feeding as a sort of foundation for today's food. And then we'll try to pile on with all of the old stuff. And then I'm even thinking of just excluding that piece of cardboard that we were covering up with at the end to try to reduce the number of flying insects, because I am starting to think that it is the cardboard that's turning into a little bit of a hangout for those flying insects, and if we deny them of that, then that would also be a good thing. Because for me, that piece of cardboard, its only function is to create darkness underneath the plastic cover so that the worms do want to come up and hang out near the surface. And since, you know, it is a translucent piece of plastic, I imagine that on a day when it's really bright and sunny and maybe some sun is shining into the wormery over here, that it might be too bright up there for the worms to want to come up and hang out there. So I'm just trying to create darkness. I could do that with any sort of piece of paper. Something that's not corrugated, something that doesn't have places for the little flying insects to burrow into or to crawl into and hide out. So I'm kind of just struggling here with the limited space that I've got. I'm still thinking I'd like to go through this stuff over here on the side, which I know is pretty dry on the edges, and mix it with the more damp stuff in the middle. But I'm really cramped here in terms of the space that I've got to do that in. Because then I think we'll have material that has a much more consistent level of moisture throughout it, combined with placing a bunch of dry paper on top. Should really help us get to the objective of not having overly damp material in the bin. So yeah, that's kind of my objective here today, is to tackle the moisture level, and hopefully in a way that it is a solved situation, so that the next time we come in here we don't see stuff that's just way too moist and damp. So I'm taking all the dry stuff, mixing it gently with the more damp stuff. Every time I find a kind of larger chunk of food, I'm trying to keep it in the pile of food that I'm collecting over there. So it's kind of a disorderly feeding, almost like a scrambling of the materials in the bin. Although, you know, I mean, once we put the plastic coverings on top too, the plastic covering is going to sort of force the moisture to stay within the bin and recirculate, and more dry materials will start to pick up some moisture from the more damp stuff in here. So I don't know. I feel kind of disorganized with this bin. Although we did get a good chance to check out all the worms and how they're doing throughout the bin. Alright, so now I feel like I've got to bring some sort of form of order back to this bin somehow. I'm not sure how I'm going to accomplish that though. I think I am going to try to sink a lot of this old paper that's been floating around on the top surface for a couple weeks now. See if I can give it a chance at hopefully someday getting broken down by the worms. Guess we'll take a lot of these food scraps that we collected along the way too and try to get it down deep into here. I just feel like I'm really running out of stuff here on the outer edges with which to cover up with in the end. So I'm wondering if I could sort of spread this out even more, because I still need to also leave a little bit of space to drop in a little bit more food, although it might not even be that necessary. But, you know, if you know me, it's a rare occasion that I'll pull away from a game plan once I've started into it. And if I've come this far, then I'm probably going to end up feeding. Alright, so let's get at least some food in here, for Pete's sakes, right? That's what we came down here to do. I guess I'm just going to risk getting my hands a little bit more purple from touching more of this purple cabbage. Guess I'll throw another one of these yummy cucumbers down in here too. And maybe another handful of this really small, fine stuff to make it into a good mix. Maybe one more, just for good measure. I'm starting to feel like these African nightcrawlers are not going to need to get fed for quite some time now. And it's going to be kicking off a fair bit of moisture over there too, right? All that food that we just put in there frozen, as it starts to thaw, it's going to also contribute moisture to the bin. And even though we've mixed a lot of the dry stuff with the damp stuff out here, a lot of it still seems maybe a little bit too muddy. I don't even know if too muddy is the right way to think about it. It's just somewhat muddy. It's not that old a bin. This bin still has a lot of time to sort of correct any sort of mishaps that might start going on. But I'm wondering if maybe we start benefiting from, I don't know. I like the idea of the plastic covering things up thoroughly, but I also like the idea of the material in the bin being given a chance to dry out a little bit too. What to do? Maybe I'll just assume that by placing a whole bunch of dry paper out onto the top surface, I will be able to capture and absorb some of the moisture that's down in the bin, some of the excess moisture that's within the bin, which might help contribute to the moisture level in here getting driven into the right direction. And just go back to covering up the whole thing from edge to edge with the plastic, and then not covering up with the cardboard, but rather covering up with something else that the flying insects are unable to get into. I guess I'll grab a handful of this paper here so I can use it as a little bit of a paper towel, try to clean up my hands a little bit, because even though it's right here next to me, I did not put grit in here to go hand in hand with the food that we just added down the middle. But maybe I'll just do something a little different from what I usually do. I'll maybe just go ahead and give the entire bin a little coating of grit across the entire top. Because if the worms are coming up to take part in the moisture that's going to be, circulating within the bin, then they'll intercept those particles of crushed eggshell on their way up. And if they need it, then it'll be there and they can take advantage of it. And I'll be curious to see how much of it remains next time we pop in here to feed, which might not need to be for some time at this point, considering how much leftover there was in the bin and how generous a feeding we just applied into here. So even though I was thinking that 9 days was a pretty good amount of time to wait between feedings in these bins this time, I'm starting to feel like we might be able to go even longer between now and the next feeding in this bin, just because we're kind of in surplus mode, I believe, in these bins. At this point I think we're down to scraps, so I might as well just empty the remainder of my shredded paper collection and be done with it. How about if we cover up the entire top? Oh, here's some other little scraps of cardboard I had laying around we could throw in here too. How about if we cover up the entire top of the bin with a piece of newspaper, like so. And here we even have a piece that I can see I had cut once in half. So this other half of it will serve the purpose nicely, covering up the majority of the top, so that this can really become the barrier, so there's no light shining down through the clear plastic, enabling the worms to feel pretty comfortable hanging out, coming up into all that shredded paper below it 24/7 without, daylight potentially scaring them away. And then this plastic will now go back on, but in such a way that it does go edge to edge to help moisture recirculate throughout the entire bin. Hopefully, all that dry shredded paper as well as that dry sheet of newspaper on the very top, absorbing some of the moisture, helping things balance out here a little bit. So, it feels like we tackled a whole bunch of different considerations here, and hopefully end up with a better outcome after the next time we come back in here. to see how things are progressing. But like I said, I think that might wait at this point 10 or more days, because I think we're in pretty good shape with these European night crawlers at this point. So I got a little bit of cabbage stains to get off my hands, and a little bit of moisture to get off my glove as well. But not too bad. I actually would have expected more based on how damp things seemed in the bin. Unless it was just an illusion. Maybe it wasn't even as damp as I thought. Maybe I was just imagining it. Alright everyone, that's it for today. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Take care. Oh yeah, it's New Year's Eve. Happy New Year! Bye now.